So when you look at the muscular system, what's unique about the cells of this system is they can shorten and exert a force. So that force might be to move things through a hollow space, like our stomach. Our digestive tract has what type of muscle to move things through? Smooth muscle, yeah, and that's under the control of the autonomic nervous system. Another type of muscle we have is cardiac muscle. Those muscles, when they shorten, they contract the heart and make those cavities within the heart smaller to force blood out of the heart or down into the ventricles if we're talking about the walls of the atrium. So cardiac muscle is a muscle that shortens and drives blood through the heart. Then we have skeletal muscle that shortens and it pulls on bones and allows us to move and navigate our environment. So there's three types of muscle: skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, and smooth muscle. And if we look for, the average amount of mass contributes to males versus females, almost half of the mass of males is skeletal muscle. So women have a little less muscle. That's why women will never be able to compete. If you take a 21-year-old male, 21-year-old female, same amount of training, the male is always going to be able to outperform the female because they have more muscle mass. So when we look at the term muscle, people thought when we contract, it looked like little mice were under the skin. So that's where it gets its Latin prefix mus, M-U-S, for mouse, because that's kind of what people thought when they looked at contracting muscle. Functions of this system are movement, maintaining posture, respiration. What important skeletal muscle is not under voluntary control but helps us breathe while we're sleeping? The diaphragm, yeah. So that's one skeletal muscle that is controlled by the medulla oblongata and a little help of the pons, not under voluntary control. Production of body heat, that's a big one. Muscle is very metabolic, very active. So it's constantly burning glucose and burning other fuels to make ATP. So that's why when they tell a person that if you want to lose weight, you don't have to get on the treadmill for an hour or get on the bike or some cardiovascular piece of equipment for an hour to boost your metabolism. Sometimes just a little bit of weight training is all people need to boost their metabolism, because the more muscle activity we have, the larger our muscle cells, the more metabolic that muscle is. And then as a result of that, a person can take in more calories because their cells are more metabolic, using those calories for energy. So it's not always about, aerobic exercise is good for the heart and lungs, of course, but just weight training alone can boost metabolism and burn more calories. So the body heat is just waste heat that muscles give off as they're using fuels and metabolizing those fuels to make ATP. So it's like our engines, right? Our engines give off exhaust, and that is hot. That's not usable energy. That's just waste heat that comes out of the back of our cars from burning fuel. Same thing with muscle. We give off waste heat. So the more people you have in a room, right, the hotter and more humid it gets because of the water vapor and the waste heat that's given off for metabolism. And a lot of that metabolism comes from muscle. Communication. Some muscle cells are connected to each other, like in the case of cardiac muscle tissue, that action potential can generate from one muscle cell, cardiac muscle cell, to the next, so they can communicate with each other. Hi, Kayla. So a production of body heat is an important function, keeps us warm. Communication, constriction of organs and vessels, again, that's smooth muscle, right? That allows those muscles to constrict. Constrict gets smaller, dilate gets bigger. So when smooth muscle relaxes, we call that dilation. And when smooth muscle contracts, we call that constriction. So when we constrict an organ, we're making it smaller. So in order to empty the bladder, we have to contract that smooth muscle of the bladder to get it to empty. If the bladder is too relaxed, then it doesn't empty. Like when a person comes out of surgery, comes out of anesthesia, sometimes they have a hard time emptying their bladder because the smooth muscle is still under the effects of the anesthesia, and it takes a while for those things to kick back in again. Same thing with the digestive tract. People coming out of anesthesia shouldn't be eating right away, even though maybe they haven't eaten since the night before because the doctor said don't eat anything before you come in for surgery because we don't want you vomiting while you're under anesthesia and getting it in your lungs and causing a host of problems. people wake up hungry, but it's always wise to start with clear liquids before we just throw some food in there, because that smooth muscle can be a little sluggish. And that's why what we do is we listen in nursing for bowel sounds. Bowel sounds tells us that smooth muscle in the digestive tract is working. So whenever you have the nurse, puts her stethoscope around your belly button region, kind of moving around the different quadrants, the 4 quadrants, they're listening for bowel sounds to make sure that that patient is ready to eat. And the heartbeat, obviously that's cardiac muscle contracting, causing the valves to open and close and giving that characteristic lubbed up sound. And we'll learn more about that in the cardiovascular system. So when we look at this microscopically, these different tissues look a little different. So if I look at skeletal muscle, I can see that there's multiple nuclei along the edge of these cells, and I can see these lines, these vertical lines or stripes. They're called striations. And we see that in skeletal muscle. Again, this is what attaches to our bones. One single skeletal muscle cell looks like a long cylinder with many nuclei. And if I compare that to cardiac muscle, I also see striations, these vertical lines, but the individual cells are branched. So they're not one single long cylinder, they're branched cells. And that's what allows them to communicate a little better with each other and function as a unit. So when the heart contracts, it contracts as a unit. Smooth muscle, if I look at this, I see single nuclei per cell, and they're tapered on the end. Some people say they're spindle-shaped, like the spindles on a staircase. They're narrow on the ends and wider in the middle. And smooth means just when I look at it, I don't see those vertical stripes, those striations. So smooth muscle, single nuclei, tapered ends, no striations. Here we see oftentimes 2 nuclei, 1 or 2 nuclei per cell, and they're branched, having striations. And in skeletal muscle, multiple nuclei per cell, and having those striations. So you'll be looking at those in lab this week, and you will have to differentiate between cardiac muscle, skeletal muscle, and smooth muscle. So we're going to spend our time in the physiology part of the class looking at the function of skeletal muscle cells. We know a lot more about skeletal muscle that we can focus on a whole unit of that, so we're gonna just work with that. And the number of muscle cells, once we're done growing, remains constant, so we can't build more muscle cells. Where did we hear that before? What other tissue did we say you enter adulthood with a set number of cells and they can only get bigger or smaller? Fat cells, yeah, adipose tissue. So the same holds true with muscle tissue. We have a set number of muscle cells and we can just make them bigger or smaller. So it takes energy, it takes moving muscle cells to get them to build and get stronger and get bigger. So we can increase the size of our muscle cells, but we can't increase the number. So when we exercise, hard exercise, not just real light cardiovascular stuff, but like lifting weights or fast running or hard biking, that builds muscle cells and makes them bigger. And then again, they become more metabolic as a result of that. And you're going to burn more calories just sitting in class, the more muscle you have on board. Okay, so when we look at muscle, it has a good blood supply, nerve supply. So if you've ever stretched or torn a muscle, it hurts, right? And if you've ever damaged a muscle, if you got kicked in the muscle, you can get a good bruise there. So it does have a good nerve and blood supply, so it can heal. That's good. And we'll look at, the arrangements where these striations come from based on the proteins that we see in skeletal muscle. So when we look at the length of a skeletal muscle, those muscle cells are in bundles, kind of like our nerves were in fascicles. Muscle cells are in bundles, in fascicles. So if I look at the sartorius, for example, that connects on the outside of the hip, runs down the leg to the inside of the knee. If I look at the length of that, depending on how tall a person is, the distance from the hip to the knee, maybe 2 feet in an adult male, maybe 1.5 feet in a female. But those cells are that long. There's bundles of muscle cells that run that length. So these cells can be very long, and again, they can increase their size, but not their number. So the more we work our muscles, the more mitochondria they have, the better they are able to convert food fuels to ATP. So when we increase the size of a cell or an organ, we call that hypertrophy. Hyper means high. Troph refers to the size. So increased size is hypertrophy. So when you look at muscle tissue, it can contract. So it can shorten and exert a force. It's excitable, which means it can respond to an action potential. So when a nerve stimulates a muscle, when it releases its, when those axon terminals release a neurotransmitter that enters the cell, or I should say it binds to a channel on the cell, opens up an ion channel and ions flow. So remember we talked about, the cells that can respond to a stimulus was nerve and muscle cell. So these guys can generate an action potential, but a nerve has to do it in the case of skeletal muscle. We'll talk smooth and cardiac muscle is a little different. Extensibility, we can stretch muscle beyond its resting length. So if I just rest my arm loosely at my side, I can see there's a slight bend to it. That's the resting length of my arm. But I can straighten it out, and I can stretch those cells a little more, and that's okay. I'm not ripping the muscles, right? So they can stretch a little bit beyond their resting length. And I would do that if I was lifting something up. If I wanted to lift up something really heavy, I wouldn't start with my elbow slightly bent. I would make sure I straighten it out, and then I would lift, because the more force can be generated when we have more muscle cells working. And we'll talk a little bit more about the detail on that. So elasticity, that it can bounce back after it's been stretched beyond its resting length. If I straighten my arm out completely and then I relax it again, it goes back to its resting length. So it's elastic, just like a rubber band is, right? I can stretch it out and it goes back to its resting length. So remember the 3 E words as it relates to muscle tissue. And the stimulus, like I said, that causes muscles to generate an action potential is the binding of acetylcholine. And we're going to talk a lot about the details of that, so you don't need to know it right now. But if you look at a typical roast in the meat department of a grocery store, you're going to see the outer covering, connective tissue covering on that roast, which we call epimysium. Epi means on top, so it's the outermost layer. And that epimysium continues to form a tendon to attach that muscle to the bone. So it not only covers the muscle, but when the muscle fibers end and it's just epimysium, that's where it attaches to bone. And remember, it attaches to these bony projections on the bone that we talked about, like the tubercles, the tuberosities, the trochanters. Remember we talked about those with the appendicular skeleton? That's where those tendons attach. It's a bumpy, bony surface for tendon attachment. And then if I look at these muscle fibers, I have to go deeper and deeper down, and I'll finally see a muscle fiber bundled into these other wrappings. So we have a big connective tissue wrapping called epimysium, and within the epimysium are fascicles. Fascicles are bundles of muscle cells. We can call a muscle cell a muscle fiber, same thing, just like I can call a nerve cell a neuron, right? So muscle cell, muscle fiber, same thing. We call them fibers because they're long. So these muscle cells are bundled into these fascicles. So the fascicle is a bundle of muscle fibers that are separated from each other by another connective tissue, which is called endomysium. So paramysium, not to be confused with the little one-celled organism you learned about in biology, different spelling. Paramysium is the connective tissue wrapping around a bunch of muscle cells. So this is a single muscle cell here. This is a single muscle cell. This is a single muscle cell. So each of these is separated from other muscle cells by endomysium. So if I pull out one of these, this is endomysium. If I pull out one, this is one muscle fiber, one muscle cell. So the muscle cell is made up of tiny little fibers that we're going to talk about. These are called myofibrils. So we can get further and further down. So sometimes you'll hear about when you're making a roast, it'll say cut across the grain. Have you ever heard that term before, cutting across the grain with meat? Across the grain means you want, if the muscle fibers are running, say, left and right, you want to make sure, or east and west, you want to make sure you cut that roast north and south. You want to go perpendicular to the fibers, because then, because that's what we see here. This has been cut across the grain. You know you've cut across the grain when you can see the individual fascicles. You can see those white connective tissue circles. If you see this, if you see long fibers when you cut, you have not cut across the grain. Now, if I take my fork and I try to cut into these long fibers in the middle of them, it's tougher. But if I try to use my fork and knife and cut between fascicles, I'm just cutting connective tissue, which is really easy to cut through. So you get a more tender piece of meat and easier to cut and chew if you cut across the grain. Okay, so look for those little circles. And any type of sandwich meat you see in the deli, you're going to see the little fascicles because they know how to cut across the grain based on the way their roasts come in the deli. So looking at how they respond to a stimulus, if I look at a fascicle here, so here's my muscle fibers bundled in this connective, this blue paramecium. I can see there's a blood supply wrapped around each fascicle, and there's a nerve that not only goes on the outside, but it passes through the paramecium and actually branches to serve more than one muscle fibers. So this is a key thing. The axons branch so that each muscle fiber is innervated. Make sure you highlight this statement right here. And what are these neurons called that stimulate skeletal muscle? We just finished that unit. What type of neuron is that? Motor neuron. Is it a somatic or an autonomic motor neuron? Somatic, because it's voluntary skeletal muscle we're talking about. So that yellow neuron that you see there is a somatic motor neuron, and the axon terminals branch to serve more than one muscle fiber. And this is important. This is how we get increased muscle strength, is how many muscle fibers I'm going to recruit to a muscle contraction. If I'm lifting a pencil or if I'm lifting a book, which is going to require more muscle cells? The book, obviously, right? So if I was doing a tug of war in the front of the classroom and I put me against 2 students versus me against 5 students, it's going to be harder against 5 students, right? The more muscle cells we recruit to an activity, the stronger the force. Because we can't get bigger action potentials, right? Action potentials only go to plus 30, and then those potassium channels open, and then the action potential is done. The way we get increased strength is more action potentials and more muscle fibers recruited. Okay, so the neuromuscular junction describes how muscle cells are stimulated. So we have an axon terminal here. So this is a motor neuron that has many axon terminals. One of those terminals is going to end on a muscle cell. So that's what we're looking at here, is just an axon terminal that has ended here on this muscle cell membrane. So here's my axon terminal. This is a motor neuron ending here. So we call this relationship the neuromuscular, here's the muscle cell, neuromuscular junction. So when we say junction, it doesn't mean they're joined and in contact with each other. It just means they're near each other. Just like a railroad junction is where the train comes into town. There's a station there, right? But they don't touch. The door of the train doesn't lead into the door of the station. There's a little space there, the platform. You get off and you go in, right? So the same thing here. We have the motor neuron secreting acetylcholine. See the little circles there with the green dots? That's acetylcholine. That's a neurotransmitter that is stored in the axon terminal of this motor neuron. And when an action potential comes down the motor neuron, that's what this is, number one. We see an action potential is generated, right, by a stimulus. This could be a reflex that's stimulating this muscle, or it could be a conscious thought coming down from the cerebrum. So an action potential travels down the motor neuron, and it opens up. It causes a change in the motor neuron membrane, a voltage change, which opens up calcium channels. Calcium is hanging around outside of our cells in the interstitial fluid that enters into the motor neuron, and it tells the motor neuron to release acetylcholine from the end of the axon terminal. So once that action potential comes down, calcium opens up. These vesicles that store acetylcholine release acetylcholine into this space outside the muscle cell membrane. When acetylcholine binds to channels on the muscle cell membrane, it opens up and sodium flows into the muscle cell. Just like we saw in the action potential, right? When I open up a channel, sodium is always in higher concentration outside of our cells because of the sodium-potassium pump. Sodium goes in. So what type of channel is this here then, if acetylcholine has to bind to it in order for it to open up? Our choices are voltage-gated, ligand-gated, or leak channels. Ligand-gated. A ligand is a chemical that has to bind to a channel in order for it to open. A voltage-gated channel means an action potential has to come to open it. Which one of these channels do we say were voltage-gated? Because an action potential has to come. What? Yes, very good. The calcium channel is voltage-gated because an action potential opens it. Ion flow, changes in charge, millivolt changes in the membrane, opens that channel. But for this one, for acetylcholine, the purple one, it has to bind in order for sodium to flow through. So the best way to understand the neuromuscular junction is really to watch an animation. So if you go in our lecture folder for this week, I want you to watch the Neuromuscular Junction Part 1 animation. And I want you to pause and really watch the steps as it proceeds through the animation so you can see each step along the way and how it leads to an action potential going from the motor neuron to the muscle cell fiber. So you should be able to list in order the specific events that occur to get that action potential into the muscle cell membrane. So I'd like you to spend the rest of the time ending up this video watching this Neuromuscular Junction Part 1 animation. And then I'll introduce the other steps and we'll follow that with the Neuromuscular Junction Part 2. But for right now, I just want you to watch the Neuromuscular Junction Part 1.